All right, hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we are taking a look at something that I think is super important for, well, just about any business out there these days.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, keeping those systems running, we are talking about IT downtime and trying to figure out how to keep it to a minimum.
Exactly. So, we were looking at some research and articles about this from, well, actually our own CloudSecureTech article.
Hmm.
And some of the numbers that we saw in there, they were kind of startling.
Oh, yeah, there are some things in there that'll definitely make you think twice about how you're handling IT, that's for sure.
Okay, so like, for instance, the average time that it takes to resolve even just a minor internet issue.
Oh, yeah, you're talking about those little hiccups and things.
Yeah, exactly. Like the ones where you just kind of like jiggle the cord a little and then it magically starts working again, right?
Right, right.
So it turns out that those can actually take almost 2 hours on average to resolve.
2 hours.
2 hours.
Serious.
I know, it's crazy, right?
That's a lot of wasted time.
Absolutely. And wasted time equals wasted money, right?
Well, 100%, yeah. Businesses these days, they rely so heavily on technology. Like, everything runs through computers and the internet. Any little disruption, it can just cascade, across all your operations.
Like a domino effect.
Exactly.
Totally. So let's kind of dig into that a little bit. Let's talk about the real cost of downtime. What kind of damage is this actually doing to businesses?
Well, fortunately, we've got some hard data, thanks to that CloudSecureTech article. They really didn't hold back, laid it all out there.
They didn't sugarcoat it.
Nope. And even those simple desktop issues, the ones that you might think are no big deal, those can still cost a business over $100 per incident. On average, something like $133, I think it was.
$133, yeah. And when you start thinking about how many of those little issues probably crop up every day,
Oh, it adds up.
it really adds up. And then, of course, there are the bigger problems.
The really big ones, like network outages, those are a nightmare. And those can easily run you over $1,000 on average.
Okay, yeah, the article said something like $1,210.
There you go, $1,210 per outage. I mean, can you imagine?
That's insane.
Hmm.
So, obviously downtime is not just annoying, it's a serious hit to your bottom line.
Absolutely.
So thinking about that, a lot of companies, probably the first thing that comes to mind is, well, we need to build an in-house IT team.
Right, right. Have your own dedicated people who are familiar with your systems. Sounds like a good plan in theory.
It does, doesn't it?
That's
It seems like that would be the fastest way to get things back up and running, too.
the idea, anyway. But, this article kind of throws a curveball into that whole line of thinking.
Really?
Oh, yeah. It points out that even the best in-house teams, they can still run into some major problems.
Oh, that's interesting. What kind of problems?
Well, for one, technology is always changing. It moves so fast, it's kind of impossible for any one team to keep up with everything.
Right. You can't expect everyone to be an expert in absolutely every single area of IT.
Exactly. Especially when you get into those more specialized areas, things that maybe only come up once in a while.
Right. You need somebody who is really deeply focused on those areas.
You need a specialist. And those are not always easy to find or affordable to hire.
It's like expecting your general practitioner to do brain surgery.
There you go. Perfect analogy. Sometimes you need somebody with very specific skills. And if your in-house team doesn't have those skills, then you're stuck.
Okay, so that's one problem. What else?
Well, even if you have a team that's pretty well-rounded, they can still only do so much. There's a limit to how many problems they can handle at once.
Right, they only have so much bandwidth.
Exactly. So when things get really busy, when you've got multiple issues going on at the same time, something's going to fall through the cracks. It's inevitable.
And then there's the whole issue of turnover.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
The article said that the average turnover rate for in-house IT staff is something like 40% annually.
40%.
40%.
That is wild. I mean, think about that. That means you're constantly having to hire and train new people.
Which is super disruptive and expensive.
Totally. It disrupts the flow of everything, impacts your stability.
So building an in-house team, it's not as simple or straightforward as it might seem.
Nope, definitely not.
But luckily, this CloudSecureTech article, it doesn't just leave us hanging there. It actually dives into some really interesting alternative models for IT support.
Oh, yeah, it does. It explores some options that a lot of people might not even be aware of.
Right, right. So let's talk about those. What are some of the other ways that companies can get the IT support they need?
Well, the first one they talk about is managed service providers, or MSPs.
MSPs.
Yeah. Basically, you're outsourcing your IT department to a specialized company.
Okay, so instead of having your own people on staff, You're basically partnering with an external company to handle all of your IT needs.
Exactly. They take care of everything. Help desk support, monitoring your systems 24/7, you name it.
Interesting. So what does that look like financially? How do the costs compare to having an in-house team?
Well, that's actually one of the big advantages of MSPs. Their pricing structure is usually much more predictable. They usually charge a fixed fee per user, so you know exactly what you're going to be paying every month.
Because you can budget more easily.
Yeah,
Especially if your company's growing, you don't have to worry about constantly adjusting your budget for new hires and all that.
exactly. And you get access to a whole team of specialists.
That's a good point. So you might actually end up with more expertise than you could afford to have in-house.
It's very possible. And because they're specializing in this stuff, they often have really sophisticated tools and systems to help them identify and fix problems before they even become problems.
Okay, so they're being proactive rather than reactive.
Right. And that can save you a ton of time and money in the long run.
It sounds great,
Yeah.
but are there any downsides? I mean, the article has to mention something, right?
Well, it does point out that MSPs aren't a perfect solution for everyone. I mean, there is an onboarding process. They need to get to know your systems and how your company operates.
Right, you have to learn your specific needs.
Exactly. And it can take a little time to build that relationship and that trust.
It's like any new relationship. It takes time to get comfortable with each other.
Right, right. And while a lot of MSPs do a fantastic job of providing personalized service, you might not always get that same level of deep familiarity that you would get from an in-house team that's been with you for years.
Okay, so there's a bit of a trade-off there. You get the scalability and the expertise, but you might sacrifice a little bit of that ingrained knowledge. Interesting. So MSPs, that's one option. What else did the CloudSecureTech article explore?
They talked about something called co-managed IT. It's kind of like a hybrid approach.
A hybrid. How so?
Well, you basically split the IT responsibilities between your internal team, if you have one, and an MSP.
Oh, so it's like getting the best of both worlds.
That's the idea, anyway. So, for example, your in-house team might handle all the day-to-day stuff, like basic troubleshooting, helping people who are having computer problems.
Right, the kind of stuff that happens all the time.
Exactly. And then for the more specialized areas, like cybersecurity or cloud migrations, you bring in the MSP.
So you're leveraging their expertise for the things that your in-house team might not be as familiar with.
Right. Or maybe you use the MSP as extra support during those really busy times.
Okay, so you have that flexibility.
Yeah.
But the article had to mention some downsides to this approach, right? What's the catch?
Well, it does say that managing two separate entities can get a little tricky.
It makes sense. You have to coordinate everything really carefully.
You need to be really clear about who's responsible for what.
Otherwise, you could end up with things falling through the cracks or even duplicated efforts.
Exactly. Communication is key.
All right, so co-managed IT requires a bit of extra coordination.
Got it.
What about staff augmentation? I've heard that term thrown around before.
Staff augmentation is basically when you bring in outside consultants to help you with specific projects or to fill gaps in your in-house expertise.
Oh, so it's like hiring freelancers for your IT department.
Kind of, yeah. So let's say you're implementing a new software system, but nobody on your team has experience with that particular system.
Right.
You could hire a consultant who specializes in that system to come in and help you get it set up.
Okay, and then they leave once the project is done.
Exactly. And the article pointed out that this can be a really cost-effective option for short-term needs.
I can see that. You're only paying for the expertise you need when you need it.
Right. But it does caution that if you're constantly having to bring in consultants for the same issues over and over again.
It might be a sign that you need a more permanent solution.
Exactly. And juggling a bunch of different contractors can get pretty complicated.
Right. Logistically, it could become a nightmare.
It could.
So you have to weigh those factors. Okay, so we've talked about MSPs, co-managed IT, and staff augmentation. What was the last model that the article covered?
The last one was on-demand support. This is the model that a lot of people are probably most familiar with.
What, like the break-fix model?
Exactly. You only call them when something breaks.
So there are no monthly fees or contracts or anything like that?
Right. You just pay for the service when you need it.
That sounds pretty appealing from a budget perspective.
It can be, but the article warns that it can also be really unpredictable.
How so?
Well, you might go months without any major IT problems.
And then suddenly, bam, you have a huge outage that costs you thousands of dollars to fix.
Exactly. And that can really throw a wrench into your budget.
It's like playing roulette with your IT costs.
It kind of is, yeah. And there's also the risk that the underlying problems might not get fully addressed.
Because they're just focused on fixing the immediate issue.
Right. They're not necessarily incentivized to prevent future problems.
So you could end up in this cycle of breaking and fixing, breaking and fixing.
Exactly. Which, in the long run, might not be the most cost-effective approach.
So it sounds like there are a lot of different factors to consider when choosing an IT support model.
There are. There's no single right answer for everyone. It really depends on your specific needs and your budget and your risk tolerance.
And I'm guessing that the CloudSecureTech article has some recommendations on how to figure out which model is right for you.
It does. It talks about a lot of different factors that you should consider.
Okay, so we've talked about all these different IT support models. But now, let's get down to brass tacks. How much is this all going to cost?
Right, because at the end of the day, that's a major factor in any decision.
It is. So the CloudSecureTech article, it actually breaks down the costs of each approach, which I thought was super helpful.
Oh, yeah, it's really good for comparing apples to apples.
Totally. So let's start with the traditional model, in-house IT teams.
Okay, so with in-house, the biggest expense is going to be salaries, obviously.
Right, because IT professionals, they're in high demand.
They are, and the article uses a staff ratio of 1 to 33 as kind of a benchmark for a small or medium-sized business.
So for every 33 employees, you need one dedicated IT person.
Right. So if you have a company with, say, 100 employees.
You need a team of about 3 people.
Right. And based on average salaries, that could end up costing you over $300,000 a year.
Wow. The article says something like $313,000, right?
Yeah, $313,260 to be exact.
That's a lot of money.
It is.
Yeah.
And that's just an average, of course.
Right. It'll vary depending on where you are, how experienced your team is, all that stuff.
Exactly. So in-house IT, it's definitely a significant investment.
Okay. So how does that compare to using an MSP?
Well, MSPs, they tend to have a more predictable pricing model.
Because they usually charge a fixed fee per user, right?
Right. So you can easily scale up or down as your company grows or shrinks.
Makes sense. And what's the typical cost per user?
The article said it's somewhere around $150 per user per month.
So for a 100-person company, that would be $15,000 a month.
Right. Which works out to about $180,000 a year.
So significantly less than an in-house team.
Yeah, it's a pretty big difference. And remember, that MSP fee, it usually includes a whole bunch of services.
It's like an all-inclusive package.
Kind of, yeah. But of course, there can be some hidden costs.
Like what?
Well, you might have onboarding fees, implementation costs, stuff like that.
Right, so you have to read the fine print.
Always read the fine print.
Okay, so MSPs could potentially save you a lot of money compared to an in-house team. What about co-managed IT? How does that work out cost-wise?
Co-managed IT, it's a little harder to pin down because it really depends on how you split the responsibilities.
Right, every setup is going to be different.
Exactly. But the article gave an example where a company kept 2 in-house IT staff and then used an MSP for things like proactive monitoring and overflow support.
Kind of like a backup system.
Right. And in that scenario, their monthly cost was about $24,000.
So almost $290,000 a year.
Right. So you're still paying for both an in-house team and an MSP, just on a smaller scale.
Okay, so it's kind of a middle ground.
It is. You get some of the benefits of both approaches, but you also have to manage the complexity of having 2 different teams.
It's a balancing act. All right, let's move on to staff augmentation. How much do those specialized consultants typically charge?
Well, their rates can vary quite a bit.
Depending on their skills and experience, I imagine.
Exactly. But the article said it's usually somewhere between $75 and $200 an hour.
So if you need them for a big project, it could get pretty expensive.
It could, but it can also be a really cost-effective way to handle those short-term needs.
Right, because you're not paying for a full-time employee.
Exactly. But again, you have to weigh the costs and benefits.
Okay, and lastly, on-demand support. How do you even begin to budget for that?
That's the tricky part. It's really hard to predict how much you're going to spend because you don't know when those problems are going to pop up.
It's like a wild card.
It is. But the article mentioned that their hourly rates are usually between $100 and $250.
So a small issue could cost you a couple $100, but a major outage could be thousands.
Right. It's a gamble. You might get lucky and have very few problems, or you might end up spending way more than you anticipated.
It's definitely something to consider. So we've looked at the costs. We've talked about the pros and cons of each IT support model.
Hmm.
I think our listeners have a lot to think about now.
I think so too. It's really about finding the right fit for your specific needs.
Exactly. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. And the great thing is, the CloudSecureTech article, it really lays out all the factors that you should consider.
It does. It's a great resource for anyone who's trying to make these decisions.
Well, I think we've covered just about everything on this topic. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of IT support. And remember, technology is always changing, so stay flexible, stay informed, and always be willing to adapt. See you next time.